Okay, here we go. We are going to wrap up January with what looks to be some sort of brawl that's going to happen between Doug Switek's brother and Holling Hood. Sometimes looks can be deceiving, sometimes they can be dead on. All right, here we go. Outside, it was still snowing, but the temperature had come up and the flakes that were coming down were the kind that really wanted to be rain but couldn't quite get there. I think my daughter calls that snain. When they hit the snow that had already fallen, they froze into a thin crust and coated everything in sight. Mrs. Baker was looking out the window and frowning, and I knew that she was wondering how the school buses would ever drive on roads with frozen crust and snow beneath that and ice beneath that. She was probably also wondering how she would drive home herself on roads with a frozen crust and snow beneath that and ice beneath that. In every other class at Camillo Junior High, the last half hour after a day of the New York Standardized Achievement Test was free reading time or snacks or story hour or something. A lot of teachers brought in brown, light, perfect cream puffs for their classes. You know what's coming next. But Mrs. Baker, the holiday-hating Mrs. Baker, had us open English for You and Me and start on a new unit, strong verb systems. It was hard to concentrate, fresh from Doug Switek's brother's rat eyes and sitting in squishy thermal underwear. But Mrs. Baker never called on me. Not even when I raised my hand. Not even when I hollered out that I could tell her why to write was a strong verb. And so the clock clicked down to the end of the school day. I headed outside watching for Doug Switek's brother, his words hovering like the snow in the air, simile. You are dead. Nowhere in the halls. I left through the main lobby doors under a picture of Ariel that Mr. Vendeleri hadn't reached. Looking up at it, I felt again the thrill of the Avenger. Forget, he threw a perfect strike and nailed Doug Switek's brother with it. A spitball, no pun intended. But I kept looking for the Vengee, still nowhere in sight, and now the cold air struck me, and I held my coat open to it, and down below my 2 t-shirts, my thermal underwear suddenly chilled, and I felt the temperature of my body drop and my face cool. Are you all right? Asked Danny Hupfer. Just swell, I said, and I really meant it. I crossed the schoolyard. Doug Switek's brother must have already gone, and came out onto Lee Avenue, where the school buses were spinning their wheels on the ice, while Mr. Goreshi stood by the fence with his arms crossed. I suppose to prevent the state penitentiary crowd from riding the bumpers, but none of them were in sight either. Which I'm sure that Mr. Goreshi was glad for, since on the other side of the street, a Hometown Chronicle photographer was taking pictures of the buses turning onto the ice, finding a little traction for a moment and then losing it and sliding sideways, flinging down snow from their yellow roofs. By the time I got to the corner opposite Camillo Junior High, one of the buses was gunning its engine frantically, trying to get some momentum, and at the same time, trying to ease around Mrs. Baker's very, very slow-moving car. And that's what made the rest of what happened happen. It took only about 3 seconds. This is the part in the movie where everything slows down and 3 seconds seems like it's going to be 3 hours. Because what's about to happen is a big deal. And I didn't see much of it since the wet flakes were coming down hard again. But here's what happened, as near as I can tell. When I got to the corner, Doug Switek's brother and the state penitentiary crowd were waiting for me on the other side. They stood in line like a platoon. And each one lifted up his left arm and pointed at me. In their right hands, they held snowballs as big as bowling balls. The streetlights were already on in the gray darkness, and their light glittered yellow off the snow's icy coating. What would make a snowball yellow? At least I hope that's why the snowballs looked yellow. I needed about a second to take that in, I guess. In the next second, the school bus gunned its ancient engine and then started to slide across the intersection. Slide sideways, that is, and through the red light. I watched as the bus's back end went by me, moving in a couple of different directions. I could see Danny's face out the back window. He was looking kind of startled, but happy. The next day, he told me that he'd never heard a school bus driver scream that way before, which I can vouch for. I heard her too. And that leaves the third second. When I started to turn back from the bus to see what Doug Switek's brother and the penitentiary crowd were going to do when the bus slid across the intersection and onto their corner. But I never got to them because walking across Lee Avenue in the middle of the road, her head down and her scarf pulled over her ears because she didn't want the wet snow to dampen her Southern California hair, was my sister. Walking back home an hour late because of the New York State standardized achievement tests. I took off. I remember hearing the air brakes and someone yelling, "Mr. Hood Hood!" and the O that came out of my sister when I hit her just ahead of the sliding bus. I remember seeing her rolling out of the way and into a snowbank by the curb, which I saw from sort of an aerial view because the right rear bumper of the bus caught me where I'd worn my white feathers. And so I was crossing the rest of the Lee Avenue intersection at a height of about 5 feet. I landed in the snowbank by Goldman's Best Bakery. Hauling, without thinking, sees his sister about to get hit by a bus and takes off and knocks her out of the way, and then gets hit by the bus himself and gets launched across the street into the bank of snow by Goldman's Best Bakery. There's level 6 for hauling. You can see that inside of him is this amazing kid he's slowly starting to unpackage. The same way that great kids always unpackage like who they are. You know, and sometimes it happens for kids before they get to 5th grade. Sometimes it happens to kids before they get to college. And sometimes it happens to people when they're adults. Sometimes it doesn't ever happen. But for Holly, you can see every day he starts to learn a little bit more and more about himself. So take that all in. Danny Hupfer was there. He saw it because he was in the back of the bus. His sister sort of saw it. Doug Switek's brother and his penitentiary crew were there with their yellow snowballs. Who else was there in the car, driving slow, who maybe helped cause it a little bit? When I opened my eyes, my sister was looking down at me. Mr. Goldman was looking down at me. Doug Switek's brother and the state penitentiary crowd were looking down at me. The bus driver was looking down at me. Danny was looking down at me. Mr. Goreshi was looking down at me. And Mrs. Baker was holding my head in her hands. Good teacher. "Hauling," she said. "Are you hurt?" "Not the part you're holding," I said. My sister was crying. "Really?" "Hauling," she said. "You saved my life." "High drama does not help us right now," said Mrs. Baker. "Hold his head out of the snow and I'll get my car." I shifted myself around. I was starting to get cold since the sweat in the little cotton compartments of my thermal underwear was turning to ice. "I think I'm all right," I said. "You'll have to go to the emergency room," said Mr. Goreshi. "Mrs. Baker is going to drive us. Can you move your toes?" Of course I couldn't move my toes. I still had on my thick socks. "No, but I think I'm really all right." Mrs. Baker pulled up in her car. "Help him in," she said to Doug Switek's brother. "And you help too," she said to the state penitentiary crowd. They gathered around me. "Mrs. Baker," I said. "Be quiet," she said. And Doug Switek's brother and the state penitentiary crowd lifted me up out of the snowbank and hefted me across the icy crust and handed me into Mrs. Baker's back seat. Mr. Goreshi, I am not crying, by the way, it's just dust and stuff. Mr. Goreshi got in beside me and held my head still, though that wasn't the part of me that was hurting. My sister got in the front seat, and we careened down Lee Avenue, stopping only to let my sister off at our house so that she could tell my mother where we were going. Mrs. Baker held her hand down on the horn at every intersection, fishtailing through most of her turns, and pretty much hit the entrance to the emergency room and one long sideways slide. When we got inside, I was limping a little, but Mr. Goreshi held on to my right arm the whole way. Mrs. Baker couldn't find the words she needed to describe the location of the injury. Shakespeare doesn't give you everything. She finally settled on his buttocks, which the nurse understood. "Are you his father?" the nurse asked Mr. Goreshi. "His principal." "Then you must be his mother," said the nurse. "I'm his teacher," said Mrs. Baker. "Perhaps a diagnostic hip x-ray would be in order?" "I'll inform the doctor of your intended procedure," said the nurse, which was a nurse joke, which is worse than the teacher joke. "I'll need to speak to one of the boy's parents before we do anything." So here we are again. Holling is at the hospital. Mrs. Baker and Mr. Goreshi are there, but the parents aren't there. Now, maybe they're on their way. Mr. Goreshi helped me back to the waiting room, and Mrs. Baker made me lie down on three of the chairs. "Stay on your side and be still," while she called my father. Mr. Goreshi took off my boots so that I could move my toes, and then found a blanket, who knows where, to stretch over me. When Mrs. Baker came back, her face was set and hard. Prediction, what does that mean? She comes back and she's clearly angry. Who is she angry at and why? Just take a second. Think about it. And let's see if your predictions were right. Your father has spoken over the phone with the nurse at the front desk. He has given approval for any necessary procedure and says that since everything seems to be under control, he will be along as soon as may be convenient. She adjusted the blanket and sat down next to Mr. Goreshi. His parents aren't coming. Again. So right now, we should have a mood. And our mood is what Gary D. Schmidt is making us feel using his words. What mood do you feel right now? And think about what words made you feel that way. We waited and waited and waited, since apparently being hit on the buttocks isn't that big of a deal in this emergency room. Outside it grew dark, and still we waited. A nurse came in to turn on a portable television in the corner, and after a few horizontal blips, there was Robert Kennedy confirming that he was considering a run against President Johnson because of the government's war policy.
The whole question of whether we are lowering the barriers with communism, and on one side of the world, and we're signing a proliferation treaty of control of atomic weapons in one part of the world, and in another part of the world we're killing people because they're communists. Sounds inconsistent, and it is inconsistent. Or the whole question of, for instance, of drugs. We permit baths, cigarettes, which kill far more people every year than marijuana, for instance.
That's right.
But there is tremendous economic power behind those people, and so that we don't pass laws to deal with that, even though our Department of Health has said that they're so dangerous, kill, 350,000 people a year. So there is this great wealth that I talked about, and that there's yet this great poverty. There are speeches made about the fact that we're going to treat everybody equally, and yet we don't treat everybody equally. There's talks given, pronouncements made, and laws written that everybody's going to have an opportunity to have a job and have decent housing, and yet 43% of the people that live in the city of New York and live in this city live in dilapidated and run-down housing and are bitten by rats. 17,000 people bitten by rats, and the poverty in rural areas is worse. So if we weren't sanctimonious about it, we weren't hypocritical about it, and we didn't perhaps tell untruths about ourselves, then I think that, and faced up to reality, then I think our country would be much better off, and our people would have much more confidence in those of us who are public officials and in our government as a whole.
And then Walter Cronkite, looking about as serious as a human being can look, and reporting the news from Vietnam. There were pictures of soldiers cutting through a jungle path. There were pictures of soldiers capturing a Viet Cong POW, prisoner of war. There were pictures of soldiers standing around supply caches. It was warm in the waiting room, and close, and the blanket was heavy, and my thermal underwear had thawed and was starting to heat up again. I yawned. I think I could fall asleep, I said to Mrs. Baker, but she didn't answer. When I turned to see why, and this wasn't easy since I was still lying down and wasn't supposed to move my buttocks, she was standing with her hands up to her face, watching the pictures from Vietnam like she was watching for someone she knew. Actually, like she was watching for someone she was worried about, someone she loved. Mr. Qureshi and I left her alone. The nurse came for me soon afterward, and my buttocks were x-rayed. And let me tell you, it's embarrassing to hold your buttocks the way I had to hold my buttocks so that they could be x-rayed. Then we waited again until the doctor came out and told us everything was fine, that I could be sore for a week or so and have a bruise that would turn purple and green, but it didn't matter since it was where it was. Then Mrs. Baker signed some papers while Mr. Qureshi put my boots back on and helped me outside to the car and settled me back into the back seat. He took the blanket with us so I could be warm. When Mrs. Baker came, he got in the front seat with her, and Mrs. Baker drove me to the perfect house. Together they walked me to the door. "Thank you so much for bringing him home on such a terrible night to drive," said my mother, and I limped out to the kitchen to eat supper standing. Over the counter was the late edition of the Hometown Chronicle, and on the front page there was an action shot of me hauling Hood, flying high in the air across the intersection of Lee Avenue and Main Street. My legs splayed out as though I really was flying, which I guess I was. Underneath was the headline, which was this: "Local hero hauling Hood soars across intersection to rescue sister." You could see her in the picture too, but mostly just her buttocks. The doctor was right about being sore. I'm not sure about the bruise, since it hurt to stretch around that far to see, but it didn't matter all that much, because when I got to school on Monday, someone had gone up and down the halls of Camillo Junior High, taping up pictures of local hero hauling Hood soaring across the intersection. They were on the 8th grade lockers, on the asbestos tiles on the ceiling, on the stalls of the boys' restroom, and the girls' restroom too, over the drinking fountains on the classroom doors, on the fire escape doors, on the walls of the stairwells, over the doors of the main lobby, and on the backboards of the basketball hoops in the gym. Can you imagine what it's like to walk down the halls of your junior high and just about every single person you meet looks at you and starts to grin, and it's because they're glad to see you? Do you remember at the beginning of this chapter that we started on Tuesday when I said, remember, we have a bookend? First he was being sarcastic because of Ariel the Fairy, and now someone has done the same thing with pictures of him being a hero. It's sort of like Macduff walking in with Macbeth's head in his hand and showing it to Malcolm, who, as we all know, is one of the king's sons, and everyone starts to celebrate because Malcolm will finally be king. But all that Malcolm is thinking is that now he has no more need for vengeance. Let me tell you, it was a great day back. And Tom Seaver had a pretty good day too. The Mets announced that they were going to pay him $24,000 next season, just like Ed Kranepool. Can you believe it? My question: who put up all of those pictures? Question 2: why does Holling mention Tom Seaver getting $24,000? And before we close up this chapter, I do want to say one more thing. Holling's parents never went to the hospital to see him. Mrs. Baker stayed there, and any trouble that Mrs. Baker obviously had with Holling because of what he said, I think that Holling has had trouble in this book kind of looking past himself, but every time he's given an opportunity to look past himself in a big way, he makes the right choice. Here, without even thinking, he saves his sister's life, and gets hurt doing so. Doesn't even think about himself. So, who put up all those pictures of hauling Hood Hood? That is the question. We may or may not get it answered, so leave a comment below telling me who you think might have done it, but here's the key. Tell me why. You can, of course, send something to, if you want to, the Class Dojo, or you can shoot me an email to my General McClain email. I will answer you anyway, and many of you are already doing that too. ClassDojo1, email to comment 3. Okay? All right. On to our next month, February. Such a good book. All right, on to the next.